Destiny has exotics. A lot of exotics. But despite so many options to choose from, many players neglect a large amount of them, refusing to even give them the attention they might deserve. After all, who's to say these exotics can or can't be a viable option in the current meta? I am! Each episode, I'll be giving myself a random underrated exotic for each class, and force myself to create a build that's hopefully both viable for PvE activities and something you've not seen before. Welcome to Destiny Workshop. Starting with Warlock, I was given Winter's Guile. Melee final blows grant a stack of Warlord's Vigil up to 5 stacks at a time. Each stack grants increased melee damage and lasts up to 5 seconds after a melee kill. I've seen this exotic paired with a glaive in a few builds, so I wanted to try and make something new. My first plan was a Nuclear Incinerator Snap. It's one of the fastest charging melee abilities in the game, so if I could generate it fast enough, I might be able to spam it with increased damage each time. For this to work consistently, I'd need to fully regen my melee in under 5 seconds. But even with fragments and armor mods helping me, I was nowhere near. So the next stop was Arc, as it's a subclass most suited to melee abilities. Chain Lightning combined with Lightning Surge would allow me to jolt entire groups of enemies, hopefully giving me enough stacks of Warlord Vigil and letting me use the unpowered melee to finish off anything left standing. I threw on Spark of Resistance, Recharge, and Feedback to give me a nice mix of melee power and survivability. I also used mods like Heavy Handed and Well of Ions. I decided to test the build in Heist Battlegrounds to see how it would perform against higher power enemies. It performed well, and I was able to pull off some nice chain reactions on large groups, but I think the build would be just as effective, if not more so, with other exotics, so I went back to the drawing board. For my final plan, I took inspiration from the exotic's name and switched to Stasis. If I could make a build that would allow me to freeze large amounts of enemies, I could use Winter's Guile to shatter my way through encounters. I used Ice Flare bolts to spawn freezing Seekers from shattered enemies, which would allow me to chain my unpowered melee on frozen targets while my Penumbral Blast recharged itself. Combine that with Glacial Harvest to generate shards when freezing enemies, which would generate melee energy when picked up. For fragments, I used Hunger to generate my melee faster, and Conduction to collect shards from a distance. I also used Rime and Chains to improve my survivability against large groups. Cold Snap felt like the best alternative to my melee, so I put that on too. For mods, I used Elemental Charge, Elemental Shards, and Heavy Handed. Weapons weren't too important, though I do recommend using a fusion with Chill Clip, a primary with Headstone, or maybe a shotgun with 1-2 punch. While Winter's Guile felt a lot more useful here compared to the Arc build, it still felt like there were better options. Karnstein Armlets would allow for better survivability with ad clearing and harder content, and Claws of Ahamkara will let you spam your powered melee more often. So, despite my best attempts to avoid it, I think Winter's Guile is only really worth using alongside a glaive. I didn't intend to create multiple builds for this exotic, and in future I'll be aiming to stick to just one per episode. But sadly, I don't think there's really much more to say about Winter's Guile, so I figured I'd do it all in one go. Maybe if we see a rework in the future, I'll come back to it. I think allowing Warlord Sigil to build up and release the bonus damage in a single melee strike would be a good change, though PvP mains are probably already in the comments telling me how wrong I am. For now, I'll be removing the exotic from the selection pool and leaving these builds with a 5 out of 10. Moving on to Titan, I was given the MK44 Standardsides. I recently made a video showcasing Solar and Arc builds for this exotic, but I left the possibility of a Void alternative open for the future. And apparently, the future is now, old man. For those that didn't watch my last build video, first off, how dare you? And second, allow me to get you caught up. The MK44 grants us an overshield when sprinting with full health, while Shield Bash, Seismic Strike, or Hammer Strike is equipped. Landing hits with these abilities will also return melee energy. We'll use the same mods as before, which will allow us to infinitely reuse our melee, so long as we stay charged with light. And because this is a Void build, I'm also going to add Well of Tenacity for a bit of additional resistance and high-end content. Shield Bash will suppress targets and grant an overshield on hit. Combine this with Controlled Demolition to apply Volatile to anyone foolish enough to stand in your way. It will also heal you and allies if any volatile enemies explode in a short range. Offensive Bulwark, I've never actually had to say that out loud before, so I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Grants increased grenade energy regeneration, increased melee damage, and increased melee range when you have an overshield. Melee final blows, charged or uncharged, will also extend your overshield duration further. For fragments, Echo of Persistence will increase the duration of overshield even further, as well as buffs like Devour and Invisibility. Echo of Domineering will reload our weapons and grant increased mobility when we suppress our enemy. Echo of Exchange will grant grenade energy on melee kills. And finally, Echo of Leeching will start health regeneration for you and nearby allies on melee kills, improving overall survivability. Constant overshield will mean it doesn't matter how greatly they outnumber you, and large chain reactions of volatile explosions guarantee they won't outnumber you for long. It's a solid build from a very underrated exotic. I'll rank this and my solar build from the last video an easy 8 out of 10. The Arc one gets a 7 because it doesn't harmonize as well as the other two, and I made one that works much better. Unfortunately, that means there's nothing else the MK44 has to offer. We've done the best we can with all 3 melee abilities, so for now I'll be removing it from the selection pool. Unless either the exotic or the melees are given a rework, I won't be revisiting it with a new build. I think we've reached the full potential here. Finally, that leaves us with Hunter. I was given the Mechanized Trick Sleeves, an exotic certainly well loved, or well hated, in the Crucible. But can we get it to work for PvE? Trick Sleeves increases the handling, reload, and airborne effectiveness stats of any sidearm. While critically wounded, swapping to a sidearm will double its damage until your health is no longer critical. To squeeze the most potential out of this exotic, it was clear we'd need a damn good sidearm to go alongside it. Currently there are only 6 exotic sidearms in the game, so I decided to start there. Cryosthesia's main draw is its freezing shot, but that doesn't do a lot of damage and needs kills to charge up. Forerunner is high damage, but mostly benefits from precision hits. It's also the only sidearm that requires special ammo, meaning you might not always be ready to fire it when at critical health. Traveler's Chosen works for ability regeneration, and Rat King will heal on reload, getting rid of the damage buff. That leaves us with Devil's Ruin and Trespasser. Both would combo with this exotic pretty well, but for this episode I'll just be sticking with Devil's Ruin, mainly because the weapon has built-in unstoppable shot, making it a great anti-champion option. I'll be running this alongside a kinetic sidearm, that way regardless of which weapon I'm using at the time, I can switch to my other once critical to activate the damage buff. Since we're talking about weapons and damage buffs, Solar felt like the best option. For aspects, Knock 'em Down will refund knife energy with kills while radiant, something that's important for later. It also buffs our super, which is kinda neat but not really important. We'll also run Gunfire Gamble as Devil's Ruin will help us charge it up, and it's also just really fun to use. For fragments, Ember of Torches will make us radiant on knife hits. Combining this with Knock 'em Down, Gambler's Dodge, and your choice of throwing knife will help keep Radiant active. The other 2 fragments aren't as important, but I put on Singeing to let us dodge more often, and Soulless to keep Radiant going for longer. But feel free to mix in your preference, fragments, or stat boosts or other abilities. Moving on to mods, we'll be running Elemental Armaments, Melee Wellmaker, and Font of Might. These combined will give us Solar Wells often, as well as giving us an additional damage buff for our Devil's Ruin. Since Mechanized Trick Sleeves only provides bonus damage at critical health, I also added Elemental Charge and Protective Light to give us bonus resistance. Unfortunately, this mod isn't as strong as it used to be. If this ever gets buffed again, I could see this becoming a much stronger build, but for now, you could swap these 2 out with something like Reaping Wellmaker and Well of Tenacity. I ran this build in a Legend Nightfall, and it did better than I expected. It's got a fun risk and reward playstyle that was satisfying to pull off, though rarely could I get the Trick Sleeves to activate, and even rarer was I able to follow it up with the Devil's Ruin successfully. So ranking for viability, I'd give it a solid 6 out of 10, but out of all the builds today, this is definitely the most unique. I think with a bit of work, and maybe some new mods or abilities in Lightfall, there's definitely something here that could be worthwhile utilizing in Nightfalls. Give it a shot if you're looking for a change of pace. And that's it! Next time I'll be looking at 3 new exotics to try, so if you enjoyed today's episode, stick around, maybe hit that subscribe button, and let's work through this mess together. But for now, I've been your host Mallow. Thank you for watching the Starcade.